Hi, everybody. My name is Mitch Weathers, and today we're going to be talking about executive functioning skills. I'm excited to be here. So let's jump in. As a way of kind of introducing myself, or I thought I would get the Zoom bar out of here. So I was mentioning before I introduce myself, we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. But I would encourage you, as I'm sure you're already doing, you have access to this slide deck. Anything that I go through that you're like interested in an individual item or asset, I'm going to put my contact information up at the end. I can share that. But if you would be taking notes, things that, kind of stand out to you, questions you might have, you can put those in the chat while we go. But we're going to try to leave some time at the end. So, as Deborah said, I'm a Gen Ed. I'm a Gen Eder. I'm also a Gen Xer, so Gen Eder. And I taught ninth grade science most of my career at a large, comprehensive Title I public high school here. And I'm based in Northern California, Sacramento now. My time in the classroom was in the Bay Area. This is actually in Illinois, as you can see. But I taught my mom taught second grade her whole career, and I'm actually going to mention her in a little bit. Um, I was in the classroom brick and mortar for about 20 years, and then I moved on to pre-COVID. I taught in a fully online asynchronous independent study program. So we were distance learning before it was a thing and trying to figure that out. And I'm only mentioning that because all of the strategies that I'm going to introduce you to today, I've used in both of those contexts, like the two kind of polar opposites of the spectrum in terms of teaching environments. I also am a father and a husband. Like to try to not be just a two-dimensional character. This is my wife of 27 years, Amber, our oldest kid, Vivian, and our youngest, Olive. And this is our broken down 1966 Volkswagen Bug that we tool around town in on the weekends for fun. So, another introduction about me, I'm a geology undergrad with a minor in geography. So, I have an emphasis, like a deep love for maps and compasses and ruler, like the whole idea of navigating with a topographic map. And I mention that to say, just as an analogy to kind of frame this work, if we think of a child's or a student's school year as analogous to picking a destination on a map, topographic map. And we equip them, of course, with their map and their compass and their ruler and their pencil and a couple other devices you need to triangulate and figure out where you are. And then we would set off on that journey together towards that destination throughout the school year. We'll call that destination academic success. And you might ask in this, especially in this era of technology and AI, why bother with an old map and a compass and a ruler, an analog setup when we have GPS? Just plug it in and let the technology do its work for us, which is, of course, a fantastic technology. And I don't know all of you well and the students that you support, but my assumption is you're seeing what I'm seeing, and in particular in post-pandemic classrooms, but that students are experiencing their education as if think of them as like backpacking, or they're out so far in the wilderness that they there is no signal, and so they can't rely on GPS. And sure, we have equipped them with devices and resources to be successful. And outside of specific assistive technologies, might I say, we over equip students at times. But if they lack the basic know how, the skills to utilize these devices and technologies, it's just more stuff for them to carry on this journey, right? And that's where these executive functioning skills come in. And I know all of you know this, so I'm going to move kind of quicker through this than I might normally, but it really is an umbrella term, and there's different kind of verticals or domains under that umbrella of executive functioning skills. So there's general definitions, and my work is really laser focused on the whole teaching learning paradigm dynamic happening in learning environments, traditional classrooms and not. It's not doesn't just have to be your traditional setting, but they are these mental processes allow us to plan, focus our attention, remember instructions, juggle tasks successfully. But I like to steer away from kind of more, if you will, academic or wordy definitions of executive functioning skills. Because my work is rooted in tier one and gen ed, oftentimes, like I had mentioned, the perception is, and maybe even the reality has been that this work has been largely in a tier two, tier three space, or in like that's what I was saying earlier. Like that's what the special ed teachers are doing. And sometimes the language around executive functioning can't may not be inclusive, and if you don't know a lot of the acronyms and what's being said. So what we had a school reach out, and I write about this in the book years ago now, so, sometime in the last decade actually, and they said they had collectively kind of committed to this idea of developing a sense of studentness in their students, and that it was just missing, that they were focused on the content and the curriculum and doing that well, and then of course aligning that to testing and assessments and incorporating technology and all the things we do, but that there was something missing. And I remember that early on in my teaching career. And it's interesting. Of course, have my credential, but I have my master's is in cross-cultural pedagogy. And I found myself in a classroom with almost entirely multi-language learners. And as a cross-cultural pedagogy, I'm supposed to be the person that knows, like, hey, I'm going to help you be successful. And my students weren't. And it was that kind of epiphany of like, oh, you don't know how to do school, right? You lack this kind of sense of studentness. And when I think of this term, I envision a student with a sense of agency and kind of dexterity in their learning. Like they know how to jump in and be an active participant, as opposed to what I saw and what, to be honest, what I experienced in my own K-12 journey was oftentimes I found myself in a classroom and I felt like I was there, but it was this thing was happening all around me. I was much more of a passive object as opposed to an active subject. And I remember watching other students in the classroom and feeling like, but they seem like to know how to do school, how to like jump in with that sense of agency. And I really believe that's where these executive functioning skills come in. So I'm going to ask you as we go through this to, if you're taking notes or even just to keep in mind some words, and one of those words is this sense of studentness, developing that in our students. The I mentioned kind of rooting this work in that tier one space or gen ed, specifically inherent to organized binder and the six executive functioning skills we will talk about over the next three sessions. You can see here, and what I've found now, and I absolutely convinced of this, when students learn to get and stay organized, for example, and when they're understanding and get practice with planning and time management and time blocking, then things like self-regulated learning and task initiation and completion, all these things start to become more feasible and realistic as students are honing and getting practice with these six skills as we're going through. And the good news is that it's all about, and this would be for good teachers on the call, is that these executive functioning skills aren't taught. And I'll talk about that in a moment here. But Paul Tough, great book. By the way, you have all these slides. So if you want to jump into any of these, the research or the literature I share, please do so. But I love how he frames it here. If we can improve a child's environment in specific ways that lead to better executive functioning, we can increase their prospects for success in a particularly efficient way. So the second word I want you to keep in mind, and this is really important, is the word environment. Um, Developing the sense of studentness, first word, and then how do we start to shape the environment? And what's really interesting, and I think um, engaging around this work, is it applies to all of us. So maybe there are a few teachers on the call. Maybe there's a few school leaders on the call. Maybe you are a therapist, but all of us have different environments. Even if we were all teachers on the call, we all have our classroom, right? But how do we start to shape these environments in ways that lead to better executive functioning? That applies to all of us. So think of studentness, think of your environment, and then if you were teachers, here's the good news. Executive functioning skills are not taught. They're best learned when students clearly see them modeled while getting daily practice employing them by engaging in a predictable daily learning routine. Okay. These three words, clarity, modeling, and routine, are kind of frame most of the talk today. And I'll talk about in a moment why this is really good news if you were a teacher on the call, the fact that they're not taught. But I say this to say what I'm not here to introduce you to is a curriculum on executive functioning, okay, or on developing executive functioning. So in the chat, everybody, tell me what state is this? I'm sure you can recognize it. It's the 50th state in the U.S. I'll give you a little hint. Deborah, are you seeing anything there?
Looks like Hawaii is a popular answer.
Yeah, good. Of course, we're all not that far away, but even so, I bet if you would probably rather be here right now than sitting here on this call with me. And I wish I could teleport us all there. But I'm going to do the next best thing is I'm going to give you a native Hawaiian language lesson. And I should back up a little bit. I designed this program organized binder that'll be kind of parts two and three that I'm excited to introduce you to. And it kind of has just organically grown and spread via word of mouth from my classroom. And I now have the privilege with myself and a team of trainers where we get to support schools around the US and internationally to do this work. And so I say that to say, yes, I do the hard work of going to Hawaii to support schools on occasion. And somebody's got to do it, right? So when I've been there, though, I joke, but it's an interesting state because the entire state is one district. Um, but when you go to different islands, of course, you have kind of a different context. But three or four people in the last couple of years after I'd give a talk or a training or a keynote or something, people that were unrelated to each other would come up and say, "Oh my gosh, there's this native Hawaiian expression that really encompasses or summarizes your approach to helping students develop executive functioning skills." And they would all say makahana kaike. It's this phrase. And they all just kind of knew it, like makahana kaike. And in the native Hawaiian translation of that expression is that the knowing is in the doing. And there's certain things in life that we learn by actually doing them, like getting messy with it, struggling with it, trying again, but that the action that what I'm actually learning by doing. And when we look at these specific skills or habits, which actually, are also cognitive processes, these are learned through repetition and through practicing by doing them over and over until they become mine as a student. And when they do, when I, for example, know how to get and stay organized, it's one thing to get organized, but to get and stay organized, I can do that. That's now a transferable competency that I take with me to new environments, right? And it's worth noting that these skills and habits we're looking at here, they're not academic in nature. These are things we all do every day in life. And what's really interesting, an expression coming out of current research around executive functioning, you're hearing them referred to as future skills. And that's really, I agree with that in that you hear it said that, the jobs of the future, many of them, we don't even know what they are yet, right? Things are evolving so quickly, especially with, of course, technology and AI. So what are we really trying to equip students with to be successful in new situations or environments that we can't conceive of yet? It's these executive functioning skills and these transferable competencies. And by the way, I've never met an educator, a parent, school leader, a therapist that doesn't think it's a good idea for students to get practice with these skills and habits. And yet, historically, I unpack this in my book, um, we've kind of left them up to chance. They haven't been taught. Now, again, forgive me. You're going to hear me say teach executive functioning skills throughout this talk, and I've said they're not taught. So I hope you can make that translation. But why have we kind of left them up to chance? I've thought about this for a long time, and I have some evidence of it. And when I don't have time to share it, but I can tell you why I believe they historically have not been explicitly taught in the classroom. And the first is just a time crunch. You find me a gen ed teacher who's walking around campus looking for something else to do, right? everybody is, it's almost like tyranny of the urgent. And, teachers don't even get to choose when they go to the bathroom during the day, right? We don't have enough time in the school day typically to get through what we wanted to. And certainly in the school year, there's always a time crunch that we're under, and there's other factors that influence that. So even if I was here to introduce you to a curriculum, where are you going to fit it in? Right? Where's a teacher going to find time to carve out and teach? This is, the importance of goal setting and how you set goals and why you should set goals, right? So there's that piece as a time crunch. And then something else that I refer to as the zone of genius, which is not my expression. There's books written on it. But I can describe it this way. When I would walk in, I mentioned my mom earlier, and she taught first and second grade her whole career. Myself again, ninth grade. And when I would visit, we both have taught in here in Sacramento. And so when I could ever get a chance to go to her school and visit her classroom, you would walk into my mom's classroom, and I've experienced this in other spaces as well, but and I know you have all done this. You walk into someone's classroom and it's like you can just feel it, right? Like I would walk into my mom's room and it's like just her zone of genius. Like she taught second grade and just did it really well. And you could sense it if you spent any time in her classroom. Interestingly, we all have different zones of genius because I would last about 5 minutes in my mom's second grade classroom because as soon as they found out I was Mrs. Weathers' son, they wanted to, hug me and they were smiling and they're all stinky from recess. And I was just like, oh my gosh, get me out of here. I'm exhausted. But give me 36 kids, 15-year-old kids with attitude in a classroom. And I'm like, I got this. This is my zone. I feel very comfortable with that. So if you take these two together, zone of genius and time crunch, like it may, like, how do I meaningfully incorporate or give students practice flexing their working memory through retrieval practice? Because we know that's what helps move things to our long-term memory. Or even goal setting, like how do I really incorporate that in an organic and realistic sense? That may not be my zone of genius around executive functioning. And that coupled with a time crunch leaves us with this situation where we kind of just hope students pick up these skills as they move through. And I can't tell you how many times now in the last few years where a veteran educator, like still switched on, loving it, you know, but 30 plus years in the classroom who will come up and say, oh my gosh, this is everything I've known I need to be doing. And I just didn't get around to incorporating it. And I think these two coupled together help explain that. Nobody's fault, just an explanation. But the good news is, with training and practice, students can develop these skills, right? The key word there is practice with training and practice. So let's look at those three keys I mentioned that executive functioning skills are not taught. They're best learned when students clearly see them modeled and they get practice with them as a byproduct of engaging in a routine. So I'm going to unpack all three of these, and that'll kind of frame our discussion for today and set us up for session two. I love this line. Ambiguity is the enemy. Any successful change requires a translation of ambiguous goals into concrete behavior. In short, to make a switch, you have to script the critical moves. And when I think of clarity with organized binder, this is one, and I know you saw one held up. This you can see it a little bit bigger here now. I'll definitely speak to this in sessions 2 and 3. But early on in my career, working with multi-language learners, it became clear to me that, oh my gosh, I'm relying on verbal communication far too much, almost exclusively. And these poor kids are having to translate everything I'm saying, everything they're reading. And that's an equity issue if there's an English speaking peer sitting next to you. And I really became convicted that I needed to have clarity so much so that could I communicate my expectations and routines in very few words, or even better said, and use no words. And what evolved from that, this organized binder, you can see those 8 tabs on the right. Of course, they're color coded and there's a letter. They all correspond to what we call system files. So each of those sections has these system files behind that tab. And each step of the routine I'm going to introduce you to in a little bit, we're in a different place that has a different color in the binder. Okay. These colors mean nothing. They're just arbitrary colors that were available and readily available. Besides gold, I wanted students going for the gold. But the letters as well, this question comes up like why A through H? Also completely arbitrary, but we know that not all students see color the same, and some students are completely colorblind. So even if you're not seeing that green C tab, it might be a shade of gray to you, but you can see that C and it corresponds to the C in the upper right-hand corner. And so if this tool, if this portfolio is the tool to participate in the routine, in each step of the routine, we're in this different place. I have all of this nonverbal visual cueing for students to engage and not use those mental calories to just try to keep up in class. And I snapped this picture maybe a month ago. This is, I think, a fifth grade or sixth grade classroom in outside of Denver, Colorado. And that white page you see up on the smart board, that's a document camera. And that's the class sample, which I'll show you one of these in a moment, under that document cam. And that white, it's the B page, the weekly life, and that's where we begin and end every day together. And so in terms of clarity, there's no student in this room that doesn't know where they need to be to participate in the conclusion of this lesson every day. It doesn't even have to be said. Okay. So absolute clarity. And Lisa Delpit says it best. It's a great read. Other People's Children is a classic now. We have to be careful not to remove the very explicitness that a child needs to understand the rules of a new classroom culture. And those rules, those procedures, those routines, if we can make it as explicit as possible, so much so that we don't even have to use words, it can be a powerful way to bring clarity to the classroom. So, one of the ways of bringing that clarity is modeling. Okay. And we know that when we're talking about these skills and moving to college and career readiness for all, we must now teach some skills formerly learned by students on their own. As I've mentioned, we can't just leave them up to chance anymore. All students need lessons and modeling of study and work and life skills, time and management, etc. So that modeling piece is really clear and really critical. This is a seventh grade teacher in Arizona. Sometime in the last couple months, I was visiting this school. We do these follow-up check-ins, and I walked into this seventh grade class with the principal, and we were just kind of doing walkthroughs around campus. And there was, you could see, of course, the students, they were all engaged, but right next to the teacher's desk is her class sample binder for seventh grade math. So it is always there for students to see and to access. Let's say if they miss class or something and they need to reorganize their binder. But the point is, it's absolutely crystal clear. And as we're updating and using this tool, this binder each day, the same is happening with the class sample so that students can see it, right? So clarity, modeling, I'm seeing it. But there's another piece with this program that's really important is here's a teacher. This is down in Ventura, California, and it's a charter high school, but you can see that the teacher's under a document cam and updating. That's the beginning of the class, the kickoff routine. But not only do you see this modeled from the teacher's modeling, but as students, this is I think this is a ninth grade classroom in Coalinga, California, where as students, that green page, you'll learn this next time, that's the second step of this daily routine. So one, I'm seeing it modeled by my teacher, okay? But as students are engaging or participating in the routine, they're also modeling it for me. So if we can go back to my students for whom English is their second or third language, I'm now using fewer of my mental calories, keeping up because I have all of this nonverbal cueing that allows me to participate and engage with the class community and clear up some ambiguity based on the modeling, right? And interesting, this is also some newer research that I find really compelling for this idea of clarity, modeling, and routine around executive functions. But what was found is that even subtle forms of attention and, of course, inattention can be passed from one student to another. And the authors of this research refer to this as the attention contagion, like the spreading of an attentive or inattentive behavior. as a virus or a disease spreads. And we've seen this. I saw it in my classroom, and I've seen it in many, many, many classrooms since. When you have that clarity in modeling, there's kind of like almost an inertia to it where the on task behaviors, it's so clear that it's almost like if I'm going to be off task or inattentive, it's either like a willful decision, or it's a sign that, okay, what's keeping you from engaging with this class community in a sense. And I mentioned that in terms of like a tier two intervention or support. Like, okay, is there something going on here? Do we need to make adjustments for you in that part of the routine? Right? Because I'm seeing it every day. It's super clear. Um, but you're having trouble participating. So if we can help resolve some of those, there's this attention contagion that happens in classrooms that I think is just really fascinating. Now, here's kind of the key of all the keys, the routine. I'm a huge believer in the power of predictable learning environments. In fact, the subtitle of my book is Executive Functions for Every Classroom, Creating Safe and Predictable Learning Environments. And routine, clarity and modeling are a part of that too, but routine plays a significant role in shaping students. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of our time, for the most part, on routine and try to unpack a little bit how powerful this is in the classroom. But I love how Doug Lemov says it, that one of the biggest ironies is that many of the tools likely to yield the strongest classroom results remain essentially beneath the nose of our theories and theorists in education consider one unmistakable driver of student achievement: carefully built and practiced routines. And the thesis of my work, of what we're going to talk about here, what I unpack in the book, and which is the organized binder program, it's all about executive functioning and developing those skills and habits in students. But as I mentioned, they're not explicitly taught, and this is not a curriculum. So if I had to just unpack the thesis, that these executive functioning skills are actually a byproduct of engaging in the routine. So if you look at here, each step of this daily routine is in a different place in the binder. Okay. And below each of those, we begin this way. You can see the executive functioning, working memory, planning and time management, organization. I'm going to see that and I'm going to practice it every single day. Right. And if you were teachers on the call, I would say notice that big green circle, because I already mentioned you don't have enough time to do. So even if you wanted to teach executive functioning skills and equip your students with those, you have a job to do. And you weren't hired to teach executive functioning skills. You were hired to teach fourth grade or whatever it may be. So we need to really protect that time. And this work, this is it. By engaging in a predictable routine, students clearly see modeled while getting practice with these executive functioning skills within the context of what they're learning. Okay. It literally is just practice through repetition, which is what routine makes possible. Right. If we have, and go back to this slide of routine, I will have educators ask, like, you mean we have to have the same routine every single day? And I say, yes, please do not stray from the routine. Be as wildly creative as you want with your lessons in that teacher class, but develop a routine, a consistent, predictable routine, and stick to it. Again, as a byproduct, they're getting practice with these skills. And we'll talk about that repetition in a moment. But if you think about that predictability, predictable learning environments feel safer. Okay. And when students feel safe or safer, they're more likely to take risks inherent to learning. And we can't forget that inherent to learning is failure. Part of the journey is failure. Back to that compass analogy in the map. Like, there's going to be times where you lose your way. And that's just part of the deal. And then when you the important thing is recognizing that, pulling out my map, my compass, figuring out where I am and getting back on track. So part of learning is failure. But if I don't feel safe, right, I'm less likely to take those risks or lean into my education and take those risks. And that's particularly true for students whose lives outside of school is anything but predictable and might skew towards chaotic. This dependability, this predictability can really have a significant impact on students feeling safe and engaging in the routine. And when they do engage in the routine, it makes for repetition, right? So if the byproduct of engaging in the routine is I get practice with these executive functioning skills while I'm seeing them modeled, then what I'm making a possibility is repetition. And I love this. The importance of repetition can't be understated. It allows a conscious skill to transfer into one's subconscious. Okay. And just think about that. A conscious skill transferring into my subconscious. When I'm trying to learn something, I'm using those mental calories. I'm focusing on it, but over time, it just becomes mine. And what's happening there is it frees up working memory, which we'll get to in a moment, allowing for further skills learning, right? So things I'm trying to learn, I'm thinking about it, I'm trying, and then automaticity takes over at some point when I've got that. And I always tell a story. I grew up playing competitive soccer, and there was one point in my young life, I think middle school or high school, and I decided I wanted to juggle the soccer ball on my head 100 times without dropping. And if I'm ever with a group in person, of course, I'll ask, like, how do you think you do that? There's only one way. You go in the backyard or somewhere and you throw the ball up and you juggle it on your head until it falls. And then you do it again and again and again and again. And I remember really trying. And then one day I was in practice, waiting in line for kind of like our, you know, drills or something we were doing. Instead of just waiting for my turn, I had gotten in the habit of practicing juggling on my head, not to be disruptive, but I would just sit there and juggle. And one day it hit me. I was like, I wasn't even counting anymore because I was so far beyond 100. It had become so automatic that I just would juggle on my head until I didn't want to anymore. And that didn't make me a better soccer player or anything like that, but it was just this idea of I'm working on this skill and then pretty soon it's transferred. It's mine. I can do it, and now I have capacity to focus on other things. And that working memory piece, I want you to keep that in mind. Another thing routine does, and I kind of mentioned this with the safety, is it consistency breeds predictability, and predictability provides security. And when I find myself consistently in a predictable learning environment, it feels safer and I can engage in that routine. And I don't have this quote for you, but if you're familiar with Deborah Meyer's work, she wrote In Schools We Trust and some other books from her work in schools in New York City. But she said something to the effect of the ideal learning environment is when the notion of failure doesn't even enter a student's head, like doesn't even come to mind. Like I'm just here and I'm learning. It's part of the process. But our environment and how we shape it can significantly influence that. So let's talk about working memory because I've mentioned it a few times, and it really is kind of the engine for learning. And it can be described as the ability to utilize information held in memory to solve a problem or task. So if it's held in memory, I got to go back and I got to access that and kind of hold it in cognitive space long enough to do something with it. Okay. That's a really important process to learning. The more opportunities I get to retrieve, and we'll talk about this in session 2, the more likely this is rooted in this is not out for debate anymore. This is the science of learning has shown that the more opportunities I have for retrieval, the more likely it is to move to my long-term memory that I'm going to get it. And working memory is kind of the engine for that process. Okay. But one of the things we need to keep in mind is that this working memory is finite. It has a capacity to it. But here's where this work gets really, I think, interesting. Clarity, modeling, and routine. When we look at routine as a shared or collective routine. So when we talk about cognitive load, it relates to the amount of information that working memory can hold at one time. Okay. Since working memory has a limited capacity, instructional methods should avoid overloading it with additional activities that don't directly contribute to learning. The cognitive load theory by Sweller is so important that if I'm in the way I always describe it, and I have on this talk already here, is mental calories. Students have so many, and if whatever I'm using them for, there's less available to focus on what I'm trying to learn. And if we can adopt a shared routine, it can shape the environment in ways that reduces the cognitive load for students. I was invited to a district last year for a diversity, equity, and inclusion symposium. And it was held at this district at a really large middle school in their auditorium. And so the district was gathering there for the talk. And as I was making my way, I got to the campus and I was making my way to the auditorium where we were all meeting before I was speaking. And I walked by and I saw on the wall their bell schedule. And I had to stop myself and like double and triple take because this was a 6, 7, 8 campus. And I went, I double checked. I was like, oh my gosh, they have 10 class periods a day and plus lunch. So that's 11 different transitions. And I asked some people, I'm like, am I seeing that right? And they confirmed. And so I started my talk. I said, when we started talking about cognitive load, I said, if you think about one, the transition to middle school is already anxiety producing and problematic for a lot of students. And students before this sixth grade year, every year prior had probably one teacher in a self-contained environment that got to know them and loved on them and their family. And that was the experience. And now I make this quantum jump to middle school where there's big kids and probably lockers. But now I have not just a few different classes, I have 10 different classes with 10 different subjects, of course, 10 different teachers, 10 different communities of students, 10 different places, geographically speaking, on campus, right? Just getting through that day, I'm using a significant amount of my mental calories. Now, if I'm also translating everything, if I have any learning differences, any processing differences, anything you can think of it's just overwhelming for students. But imagine, not that I'm advocating for a 10 class period day, but what if all 10 of those teachers adopted a shared routine? So, how we begin, how we transition, where we put our stuff, how we conclude, when we set goals, all the stuff we'll talk in sessions 2 and 3. If those were the same, then how I do school, how I keep up with the community, I'm not using any of my mental calories for that. And I can focus those on what I'm trying to learn, which is why working memory and cognitive load are closely related to um, self-regulated learning, right? So environmental transitions, we can impact them in routine in the environment if we're sharing. So here's your little science of learning lesson for today. There's two types of cognitive load we don't ever want to get rid of that are related to learning. There's other types we could talk about, but intrinsic load, learning new information, and the germane load, which is linking that up or making connections with things I already know. You don't want to take these away. These are part of learning, okay? But they tax that working memory because it has a capacity. But here's where we can get creative and think of that middle school student going from class to class to class if everything really was different, right? If we can reduce this extraneous load, then we free up capacity. And here's kind of another way to look at it that I think makes sense is that you can see the entire working memory capacity and germane and intrinsic load are they're going to be there. But if I can reduce that middle band, that extraneous load through clarity, modeling, and routine, I free up capacity to focus on what I'm trying to learn. Okay. So that shared routine, and it's rooted in collective teacher efficacy, which if you follow the research, collective teacher efficacy is consistently, it has one of the biggest effect size, right? So if you're familiar with the visible learning and John Hattie's work, collective teacher efficacy um, is almost always at 1 or 2. This is kind of always being updated, but that hinge point represents in 1 year an average growth and development in a student. So when we look at what sets students up for success, anything that has a zero point 0.4 or above is a positive effect size, right? Things we should consider incorporating. Zero point 0.8 would be 2 years growth in one school year. 1.2, you think you get the idea here. So look at the collective efficacy, 1.7 or 1.57. But I'm empathetic if schools are struggling. Like, how do we get collective? Well, because we're so siloed by definition. We'll keep it at that middle school. You might teach eighth grade ELA on seventh grade, math. I'm sixth grade science. We're in different places. Like we're siloed by definition, but we could get collective around clarity, modeling, and routine because it's content and grade level agnostic, right? And in doing so, with these reforms, I just kind of wanted you to think about this. I know a lot of you are supporting the teachers. Um, a reform, but you've got to have both ways. Like if we're being collective about something, it can't be rigid 100% of the time, right? So a reform has limited effectiveness and no sustainability if it's not flexible. But on the other hand, a reform needs to maintain fidelity to its core principles. And it's this tight but loose combination. And instead of reading all of this to you, if you think about us getting collective as a staff or a district around clarity, modeling, and routine, I still have the loose side is what I'm teaching, how I'm teaching it, my lesson, right? And I don't want to say it's easy to get collective, but it really is kind of easy. And now, not only are we reducing cognitive load for students, they're getting practice while seeing modeled these executive functioning skills from class to class to class, or in an elementary school from grade level to grade level to grade level. And I mentioned this earlier, I've kind of been mentioning it throughout our time before we wrap here, is this work is really designed and meant to be in the core classroom, in the gen ed classroom, tier one, for all students. And the reason for that is that in the absence of a true, and I don't want to confuse anybody with the term universal, but in the absence of an authentic tier one resource or intervention, then we run the risk of overtaxing the system, right? So I was last month was speaking in New Mexico. They call it MLSS there, multi-layered system of support. And the person who introduced me shared that in certain districts, they had at the tier two level, as many as 60 or 70% of students referred, which is just not possible. It's not sustainable, right? So to me, it's shouting that the evidence that there's not a tier one, and a tier one, in my opinion, as an intervention, is meant to do a few things. One, all students get practice. If there is a concern or an issue, at times that intervention or resource will help mitigate or address that in the tier one space. And then if something is persistent, then we have a more authentic tier two concern or intervention that we can't have 60% of kids referred, right? So it's a friend of mine says, you can't tier two yourself out of a tier one problem. But again, what do we get collective about? How can we get it for all students? And that's where this executive functioning work happens. And this is what the research is suggesting. Schools cannot expect change in outcomes until initiatives are implemented by the majority of teachers. Again, that collective efficacy. And I thought I would throw this in just for fun, some data at the end, because this works. This works. Like these, and I'm going to show you these. This is more typically what we see. This is the ninth grade transition data. That there's a drop in ninth grade, similar to the middle school transition. And when we look at this work around executive functioning, and these are organized binder schools. The reason I'm showing you this data, we don't have access to student data unless it's shared with us, of course, but these are snapshots of grade books of the same students. And it's cool to year after year after year compare student data. That's important, I believe. But it's really interesting when this teacher, for example, transfers to a school in the same district, has those students, takes a snapshot before, and then implements an intervention at tier one, and then shows a snapshot after. Um, and in every single class period, you can just see the number of students passing as they're through this clarity modeling routine and getting practice with these skills. This is older now, from Oakland High School, year after year. This is not the same students, same school, but they saw subject area gains in their subgroups as well, in their math and ELA scores. And this was their main intervention, which is content agnostic. And I think it's really interesting when you see students progress. And we haven't talked about grades, we haven't talked about content, curriculum. It's about developing the whole learner. then the last bit of data, and then I'll wrap up here. This was a brand new teacher who reached out right after that big blue bar in a total panic her first year. And this was a snapshot number of missing assignments, right? And an overlay of number of students with A's, um, just as a result of developing their executive functioning skills. Okay, I always end with Dweck. I'll do it every time because I really believe in this quote that simply raising standards without giving students the means of reaching them is a recipe for disaster. It just pushes the poorly prepared or poorly motivated students into failure and out of school, right? So the means of reaching them, I believe, is this executive functioning. So I want you to noodle on this. What's your number one takeaway? I told you I put my contact up. Deborah, I apologize. I probably went longer. I wanted to leave more time for Q&A. Um, but that's what I have for you today.
There is no reason to apologize. I'm kind of reading the minds of the folks who are on with us today because I'm certain that people are thinking, gosh, these are some of the very ideas we've been doing in our world and helping to support kids, coming up with routines, etc. What does it look like in a gen ed classroom? People are at a different level of interaction with the gen ed classroom. Some people are on consult, some are push in, but we know that everybody is talking about inclusion and being in the same space. So I challenge folks to look at the opportunities to learn what the routines are in the classroom. And maybe when you're working with them, let's say for communication, if there is a routine, I'm just going to pull out circle time, for instance, and we know that kids with more complicated bodies and communication, having circle time and knowing that my child who uses augmentative communication now knows what that routine is and can even see themselves in being able to be part of or taking a role in circle time. So us looking at our kids and how we can talk to the teachers and looking at what the routines are, how can we use this with all of our kids? I just think that the points that you made today, as Lisa says, is fabulous.
Thank you.
How do we increase those communication activities and opportunities?
Yeah. For students, it's interesting that folks in your role, kind of this, just speak generally, support role that are pushing in with students into class, either routinely or on occasion. I've had the feedback has been when we walk into a classroom as the adult support and we can't figure out what's going on, how is this kid going to figure it out? But when you walk into a classroom using organized binder or these strategies, it's like they're like it's so crystal clear so that the support is happening there. I can help them in the moment, but also on in a support class or at a later time, there's kind of clarity on both pieces. And it's analogous to the way we approach family engagement around this. And that'll be next time or the third time. Because I really believe that these executive functioning skills are developed at school and that the family is the support piece. In fact, we have a guide for families that goes home, as opposed to families trying to do it at home with their students. It oftentimes turns into a battle of wills. It's like, I've already been at school. I don't want to do this right now, right? But if I can support it and it's happening in the classroom, similar to what you're doing, I think it's a win.
Absolutely. The question about how about kids who've got to come through all the way through high school with these kind of strategies? Do you think college is going to be harder? Well, Chandra's comment was right on, hoping that kids are starting to gain and look at ways that they can create and break materials and projects down so that they have the skills that transfer to other areas. What would you add to that, Mitch?
So the question was, what if I had this experience, then I get to college and I don't have the program again?
Okay. Right.
Yeah, no, great question.
Yes.
And that's where the notion of executive functioning skills becoming transferable competencies and being really explicit about that. I mean, that's a lot of the work we do, especially at that upper high school level. And we work with colleges too, but saying, hey, what might this look like? Here's what's coming next year. And we'll talk about all this next time when we every day we get a chance to look at what we call the agenda, which is basically a calendar or a planner, and talking about, hey, when you get to college next year, you might have a professor that gives you a syllabus and you're just supposed to be ready to go on week 15, and they're not going to talk about it anymore because you're in college. There's going to be, here's what I should have read, here's what's due that day, and this is all you have to do. Take your planner, take the syllabus, write all those due dates down for the whole semester, and just make sure you're looking at your planner every day. It's making it like this is how simple this can be. You'll see all the system files up close, but it's a table of contents. Create your own table of contents, that kind of thing. And what's funny is oftentimes students will write back to their teachers, can I get that page on so I can use it in my class? But the whole notion is not a reliance on a tool or a program, but that it's because it's these skills. Okay, how would I manipulate that? And we can also talk about how do I, of course, make that transition to the digital literacy and what's it mean to be organized and manage my time and do all of that in that capacity on my own. But that's where the skill comes in, which is developed through practice.
Absolutely. I love that. And so then as we talk about therapists and the broad range of abilities, some of us work with very low incidence disabilities, as Joy mentioned, supporting kids with TBI, who we know working memory and routine are very key. But any
Yeah,
disability that we look at, working memory and routine are key. And oh, by the way, for any and every student
right.
working memory and routine is key, including ourselves. So
Mhm.
I'm just so appreciative of the approach and the perspective that you brought to us today, Mitch. We will be sending out a survey, just asking a little bit of feedback and helping us to prepare for next time. And that is in, I think it's, what is that, May the 7th? I
Just
intend
yeah,
to
it's
have
not
it
too
on my
far away. Yeah,
brain. Oh, no, April, there's another one in April, I believe, in two
yeah,
weeks.
it's pretty. They're pretty close.
And thank you for that. So just really encouraging you to think about, well, how can I make this work in all of the environments? So thank you all for your input. Once you click submit on the survey, you're going to get a certificate of one contact hour credit for today. And we appreciate you being here, sharing your perspective. Let us know how you think
Hmm.
about this in reflection. Mitch,
Yeah, and if anybody wants to, you have my email now. If you don't have to wait until next time if you have questions or you want to share your like what was your aha moment or takeaway from this, or if you want to challenge me on something, I'm always open for those conversations too. But I appreciate your time, everybody. This is a real honor to be with you. So thank you, Deborah, for the opportunity.
all right. Well, we'll be sharing the feedback and planning for the next time. Thank you all for what you do every day for kids. That's our future. Thanks for the investment.